Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Vicki Fishman, and I am the Director of Government and Community Relations for the JCRC of Greater Washington. Before we get started, I want to let you know that tonight's program is being recorded. In addition, live transcription is available. You should see an icon to click at the bottom of your screen to activate it on your own window. Also at the bottom of your Zoom screen is a Q&A function. Please put your questions there, and we hope to have time to get to them towards the end of our program. As the public affairs arm of the organized Jewish community in the region, the JCRC does mostly local work. We are deeply engaged in issues of immediate concern to our local institutions, security for our facilities, combating anti-Semitism, Holocaust remembrance, teen engagement, Israel education, and supporting the social action work of our Jewish community. So when it comes to the national and international issues that demand our attention, we are honored to partner with groups like the ones joining us in today's programming. Thank you to our co-sponsors, Addis Israel Congregation, the Indianapolis JCRC, Uyghur Human Rights Project, 3GDC, Uyghur American Association, and Jewish World Watch. Finally, before turning the program over, I would be remiss if I did not give a particular shout out and thank you to Karen Guberman and Addis Israel's Uyghur response team, without whose passion and dedication, tonight's program would not have come together. And now is my honor to turn the program over to Rabbi Sarah Krinsky.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. An honor to be here with you all. And thank you, Vicki, for the introduction to the program and to JCRC, and really for all that you and your team are doing. And I also wanted to echo the thanks to not just all the organizations that are here, but in particular to the leaders of our Uyghur response team, Karen, Nahama, and Eli, who have sort of decided that this was an issue of utmost moral importance, of which they are, of course, right, and really continue to raise its profile in the congregation in very powerful and inspiring ways. So thank you to the three of you and to all that you've done. So just a quick word of Torah to sort of frame how it is that we're thinking about tonight. So the Parsha for this week, the piece of the Torah that we're reading this week, it's the story of the golden calf, which is one of the richest stories in the whole Torah. I keep saying that we deserve a Parsha like this because the last 2 weeks and the next 2 weeks are some of the drier parts of the Torah describing the building of their tabernacle. But this week we get a really deep human story of struggle and of challenge and of loneliness and of disappointment. And it's really the Torah, I think, at its most open and relatable. So there's one particular sort of cycle that we enter into in this moment of the Torah. You know, in the broadest sense, I think the story of the Torah is a story of oppression and redemption and how those things cycle over and over again, right? The Israelites were oppressed and then they were redeemed, but they were redeemed in order that they were redeemed so that they could bring about redemption for others who were oppressed. And I think the Jewish story at its biggest really is about moving between these cycles of oppression and redemption, between narrowness and expansiveness. But this week we get a little bit of a different cycle, and that's a cycle of brokenness and wholeness. So famously, Moses, who's coming down the mountain from having just received the 10 commandments from God on these 2 tablets, when Moses sees the golden calf and sees the people in the midst of their idol worship, he takes the tablets and he smashes them on the ground and they shatter into lots of pieces. And Moses then erupts at the people. God erupts at Moses. There's all of this sort of brokenness and challenge and strife in the air. And slowly, we start to see the repair happen. And Moses intervenes on behalf of the people with God. And God shows God's self to Moses in this moment of beauty and intimacy. And slowly we imagine the shards kind of coming back together. And indeed, Moses then goes back up the mountain and comes back with a new set of tablets that are whole, that are perfect, that are unbroken. But what our tradition teaches is that the broken tablets weren't just left in the base of the mountain. They were actually carried with the Israelites throughout their trek in the desert. Munachim beyachad, they were placed next to each other, the broken and the whole tablets, in the Ark of the Covenant as it was brought through the desert. And I think the lesson there is that just as redemption and oppression are their own cycle, just as we were redeemed in order to bring about more redemption for the oppressed, so too do we move constantly through these states of brokenness and wholeness. And that happens on individual levels, but it also happens on community levels. And, you know, we as a Jewish community have certainly experienced our share of brokenness and our share of shattering and scattering, right? But in these moments in which we feel like we are able to touch wholeness, not that our wholeness is perfect or complete by any stretch, but in moments in which we're able to touch that wholeness, to open ourselves up to living side by the brokenness that is also in the world, and to finding the holy spaces of connection to bring that next set of brokenness into a little bit more healing. I'll just close by sharing that you know, in Jewish spaces, when somebody does something that you want to congratulate them on, you'll often say Yasher Koach, which means may your strength continue. And that phrase comes from a piece of the Talmud in which the rabbis are discussing just this incident. And the rabbis say that there were 3 things that Moses did against God's wishes, but that afterward God said to Moses, Yasher Koach, that was strong of you to do, that was the right thing to do. And the first one is that without instruction from God, in fact, probably to the contrary, Moses broke the tablets. And when Moses broke the tablets, the Midrash imagines, God said, Yasher koach sheshibarta, thank you to you for having the strength to break open. So tonight, what I pray for us and what I dream of for us is that we also have the strength to break open and to break our hearts, to crack them, to let in the brokenness of another, and to collectively move a little bit closer toward healing and toward that wholeness, living side by side. So to get us really started in the program itself, I'm going to turn it over to Addis's Social Action Chair, Brad Brooks-Rubin.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Krinsky, for those words, which I know will guide us throughout the evening, both the brokenness and from the stories that we will hear, and understanding the world that we are in and the wholeness of the world that we imagine we can build through actions like this. And a huge thanks to Vicky and the JCRC for getting us started. And I'm gonna have the privilege and the honor of moderating tonight through our 4 remarkable speakers, a bit of discussion among them, and hopefully as much time as we can for Q&A. And I'm going to introduce each speaker as I turn to them to provide their opening 4 or 5 minutes of remarks. And I have the extraordinary privilege of beginning with Mihrigul Tursun. She is a Uyghur concentration camp survivor, activist. She's a winner of the Initiatives for China's Citizen Power Award. She has been detained multiple times in her returning to China, and has a really harrowing and remarkable story to share with us, to really root us in the human side and tragedy of this crisis and this issue. So, Mihrigul, over to you.
Hi, hello everyone. I am Mihrigul Tursun, and I am very happy to with you guys here, share my story. And also I'm very thankful for Jewish community to give me this opportunity to talk with my story. And also I will tell the Jewish community, we love you so much. And also we are very thankful for you behind with us always. And yeah, actually, I am from 2015 to until 2018 when in the Chinese concentration camp, more than 3 times, but total more than 13 months. And I've been get electric shock, torture, physical and the psychological torture, and get by the Chinese government surgery to cannot give more baby. And they care, actually, when I go back China from Egypt, I have triplet it's 2015, March 15, I breast triplet. When I go back China 2015, I have this more than 2 months old children with me, 3 children, 2 boy, 1 girl. And then from airport, Chinese government harassed me to take me to detention camp because of one really reason is religion, another reason is because I am Uyghur. Then after when I go out from concentration camp, because they killed my one kiddos, and now I have one son, 1 daughter with me. And so this is all concentration camp. I being multiple time, but total in 3 years I was in the China concentration camp. So I witnessed 9 women die in 3 months with me, same cell. And there's this cell, we cannot go outside from the cell. Inside, some women over than 13 months didn't take shower, didn't go outside from one cell. And we stay in the very small cell, more than 64 women. And every day, they take a lot of women outside, and they attend a new woman inside. And we don't have enough food. Even we don't have vegetable, we don't have meat, even we don't have water. Every day, some small bread. And we cannot take shower. We cannot talk with anybody, with family. We don't know anything about outside. So this time, I don't know about where's my kids, my father, mother, sister, brother. But finally, because my kid is born in Egypt, this reason, I should permanently get out from Chinese concentration camp. And then after that, United States government helped me with my kids, bring me to US. But they killed already my 1 son, and my father, mother, sister, brother. All is from my family, 26 people until now in the concentration camp. Actually, this is not concentration camp, because this is death sentence. Because everybody goes here, we just waiting that nobody don't know what happened tomorrow or what happened after that. So it is a very horrible situation. Our situation little bit similar also, like before this is a Jewish community. So and then so when we come to US, there's a lot of government, US government, especially a Jewish community behind us, helping us and support us. Because until now, the whole world, let's say, more than 3 million people in the concentration camp, but I am sure it's not 3 million, maybe more than 8 or 10 million people, because every day people die. And then every people children doesn't know where is parents don't know where is the children. So and from my family, 26 people, already 8 people dead. I received this information from my homeland, but until now I didn't know about where's my father, mother, sister, and the brother, and I didn't know any information about them. So when I entered the concentration camp, I was 25-year-old. Now I am near to 31-year-old. My all young time and my all life is gone in concentration camp. So I am here as a witness, a Chinese concentration camp witness, and so I am here healthy, not very well. I lost my right ear hearing because of torture. I cannot have more baby. Until now, I didn't know where is my husband. I cannot find them. And now I stay in US safety, but I still losing my father, mother, sister, brother, and the husband, and the one of children. I stay with my 2 disabled kids. They are 6-year-old now, and 1 daughter, 1 son. They are disabled. We are stay in the US. So I am very appreciate for this Jewish community give us this opportunity, and we hope you and you guys, we are together fighting with Chinese government and help your community help us to push the Congress, let the Chinese, let the American government accept for help Uyghur refugee to come to United States. This bill, we hope that they are signed, and we are always with you, and you guys stay with us. Thank you so much for everything, especially my kids and me. We are very proud of you, and we are always thank you for you so much. That is all about me. Because time reason, I cannot speak more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mihrigul, for the for what you've shared, for your bravery, and after all that you and your family and obviously your people have endured. We're grateful for your willingness to share that with us and to root us this evening in what you have experienced, and we will certainly come back to some of the advocacy issues that you mentioned at the end. I'm going to turn now to Andrea Gilman, who is a senior program manager for the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Memorial, where she focuses on policy, outreach, justice, and accountability efforts for mass atrocities, and leads the center's work on Burma and Myanmar. Andrea has held roles at Physicians for Human Rights, the Burma Lawyers Council in Thailand, legal projects on immigration and reproductive rights, Human Rights Watch's women's rights program. And she's going to, in some ways, take us from the stories that we've just heard to a broader spectrum of what's been happening to the broader community and how the Simon-Skjodt Center has evaluated and analyzed it through a report they released last year. So Andrea, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you also to Rabbi Krinsky for movingly setting the frame for tonight's conversation. And most of all, thank you, Mihrigul, for sharing your story. It's because of survivors like you that we know what is happening behind these closed walls of the detention camps in Xinjiang. So thank you for coming forward. I'm speaking on behalf of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which stands as a reminder that how we confront mass atrocities can send a message to persecuted groups around the world. It sends a message to perpetrators. I think the museum also reminds us of what happens when we do not act to protect populations in danger. I work with the museum's Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and our center seeks to do today for communities who are at risk of genocide and crimes against humanity what was not done for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. The Simon-Skjodt Center focuses on particular areas where populations are at risk just because of who they are. And over the past several years, we have become increasingly concerned with the Chinese government's targeting of the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. And we heard, I think, so deeply about the trauma and the harm and the pain that is caused by these policies by the government. We know that the Chinese government's assault on the Uyghur community is alarming in both scale and severity. Official estimates are between 1 and 3 million people, but as you just heard, that there might be many more. People who are mostly Uyghurs have been detained in a system where people are sharing these horrific stories of abuse and what happens behind those closed doors. And it's sometimes hard to imagine extrapolating Mihrigul's story and what has happened to her family over the potential, the millions of people who have been forced to endure such atrocities and such pain. The Uyghur population is currently experiencing some of the most serious crimes known to mankind, and the trauma that is inflicted will harm generations, I think, as you've heard from her story. So as Brad mentioned, a few months ago, the museum released a new report that outlines our grave concerns that the Chinese government may be committing genocide against the Uyghurs, and also that there's a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity, including persecution, imprisonment, forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, and forcible transfer are being committed, and that these crimes are being committed with impunity. I think when we reflect on the crimes against the Uyghur people, we see this failure of the world's commitment to never again witness what we had seen after the Holocaust. It's a failure of that cry of that duty on all of us. The Chinese government has sought to eliminate the culture of the Uyghur community, and today, we're fearing that they're trying to eliminate the population. As we laid out in our report, the Chinese government is failing in its legal obligation to prevent genocide. It has the obligation to the duty to prevent genocide against people, and is certainly failing. And the seriousness of the assault on the Uyghur population demands, a global response from the international community to protect Uyghurs and others from this kind of crimes. We are particularly concerned about crimes being committed against women. The Chinese government's crimes they're marked by this deepening assault on Uyghur female reproductive capacity as one aspect of the targeting, through forced sterilization or forced IUD placement. And throughout history, when we think about how we understand the crime of genocide, women too often have not had sufficient attention paid towards them as victims of genocide, and how crimes might specifically target women as a group. We know that in many cases, perpetrators will go to extreme lengths to hide what they're doing and to deny the nature of their crimes. And the Chinese government certainly has been trying to do this. They were restricting access to the vast network of detention centers and prisons, and to the millions of people whose lives they are persecuting. And so information has come out from survivors such as Mihrigul, and other Uyghur activists, Uyghur researchers who do so at great risk to themselves and their families. And often when we're faced with a situation of this scale, it's natural to feel overwhelmed or that solutions might be out of reach. But indeed, I think when the perpetrator of mass atrocities is a global superpower, the traditional tools that we have in terms of atrocity prevention are tested. I think what is most clearly and urgently needed is for the Chinese government to immediately halt the commission of mass atrocity crimes against Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I know in the conversation tonight, we'll get to what we can do, but I think we need to remember really the onus is on the Chinese government to immediately stop this. Given the scale of the crimes and the unique challenges posed by China as a particularly dedicated and able perpetrator, there needs to be a coordinated and global effort to confront mass atrocities, so countries can come together to focus on things like collecting and analyzing information from Xinjiang and supporting accountability efforts, sending the signal that these crimes cannot continue and that people will need to be held responsible for what they have done. Private companies have a role to play here. They can make sure they're not relying on the use of forced labor or supporting the mass surveillance of Uyghurs and others. This mass surveillance that serves as a pipeline into the detention system that we heard about so movingly from Mihrigul. Just in closing, this is a move. It's a time when the Never Again movement is being tested, and China's crimes against the Uyghurs could be a terrifying blueprint for other authoritarian governments to target their own people. And for this reason, a global, a coordinated, a swift effort is required to stem these crimes now to protect Uyghurs and also ensure that other populations potentially around the world don't face these tactics in the future. I'll pause there. I'm happy to turn it back over to Brad.
Thank you so much for covering so much ground in just a few minutes and really leading us through to the next couple of speakers who are going to focus us much more on the question of what we can do and how we can be a part of change. I would just first encourage everyone to put questions in the Q&A so that we can come back to those during the discussion section. And I did just want to sort of flag before we move on Andrea's last point. I think in some ways all of our panelists work on the Uyghur crisis, but also work on other issues or do currently or have in the past. And there are so many signs and so many crossovers and patterns that we can learn from here that we need to ensure we're doing what we can on this, but on other crises as well, because the Never Again movement is tested here, but in other parts of the world. So thank you for that framing and leading us to the next speaker, Ms. Louisa Grieve, who is the Director of Global Advocacy for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Previously, Ms. Grieve was Vice President for Programs and East Asia Director at the National Endowment for Democracy. She has past experience at the Special Olympics International, the Corporation for National Community Service, and the UN Development Program. She's an experienced nonprofit advisor, an expert on human rights in China, having traveled and worked in China since 1980, and her first visit to East Turkestan was in 1988. And she brings obviously an enormous wealth of experience in working on this issue. And so, Louisa, I would ask to turn to you to begin to focus on the work of the recently nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, UHRP, and the kinds of things you've been trying to do more generally to bring attention to this and start to move things forward. So over to you, Louisa. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Brad, and thank you to the organizers. I'd like to ask for a double check on whether my voice and video are working.
They are.
Very good. Thank you all for being here. We've had some tremendous successes working together. Concerned groups, genocide prevention groups, as well as human rights groups in the Uyghur community. I'd like to just mention two of those successes for you right now. In fact, the US is the only country in the world that has passed dedicated policy enactments through the legislation with very broad bipartisan support and just tremendous source of hope for Uyghurs around the world. The first was the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which was signed into law in June 2020, requiring reporting on the part of the US government and sanctions, global Magnitsky sanctions, which are quite serious, targeted human rights sanctions, freezing the assets of named perpetrators. Up until now, those sanctions have been imposed on 8 individual officials and on 2 government entities. The next piece of legislation, also passed with incredible bipartisan support, was just enacted into law on December 23rd, passed unanimously in the Senate, and by a vote of 400 to something I think with 1 dissenting vote in the House. This is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this goes to the question of corporations and the forced labor issue that Andrea just mentioned. Although the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan, is very landlocked. It's the capital city of Urumqi is the farthest from any ocean of any capital of any important region. Nonetheless, it is well integrated into the international economy. And so, for example, 1 in 5 cotton garments in the world may well have Xinjiang cotton in it. And we know because of well-documented, large-scale government-imposed forced labor in agriculture and in manufacturing, from electronics to solar products to the garment industry, there is a very, very high risk. And so what this law does is provides a special enforcement of existing US law against the import of forced labor goods by putting the burden of proof on importers to show that any goods they may have that anywhere in the supply chain, things mined, manufactured, or grown in the Uyghur homeland is not produced with forced labor because of the very high risk. There's a lot of enforcement to be done. So all of you who would like to get very involved in enforcement efforts, certainly UHRP and other groups would very much welcome your participation. But let me talk about what's ahead. There are 2 additional bills. Mihrigul asked for your support to rescue Uyghur refugees. There are some small number, it's in the tens of thousands, not the millions, of Uyghurs who have immigrated to other countries. And then there's a small number of people who have gone to other countries where they do not have secure residency. This is primarily Turkey and Central Asia, as well as a smattering of people in Middle Eastern countries, Southeast Asia, and a few other places. These people are at extreme risk of forcible deportation because the Chinese government is not content to persecute unto the ends of the earth every Uyghur in their own homeland that's under the Chinese control, but to try to bring people back and not allow any Uyghur to freely live, and certainly not to advocate for Uyghur human rights, to protest the genocidal acts against their family members and their people. So it's not a heavy lift. It's nothing like on the scale of the refugees, for example, from the Syrian conflict. It's in the tens of thousands. So this bill Mihrigul is asking for your support for is called the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act. And I will put in the chat, I hope everyone will see it, a link to the website of our organization that will give you a link to both this bill and the next bill I'll mention. So I can get that through. All right, so the second bill that needs further, and that bill, by the way, I should say, has only 3 co-sponsors in the Senate and 27 in the House. And I'd just like to appeal to everyone here, would you call your member of Congress? You can look up on the website the numbers of the bill, but the first is the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act, just to rescue people who are not yet in the clutches of the government. We can prevent the genocide from succeeding by rescuing those people who are still potentially savable. The second bill is called the Uyghur Policy Act. The name is very similar to the bill I mentioned before, but the Uyghur Policy Act is to create a special coordinator, a US special coordinator for Uyghurs. And this would tremendously advance policy. So both of those bills are at the link I mentioned. Now I'd like to move on to some other coalition work, specifically regarding forced labor imports. We would like more groups to join a very broad coalition called the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region, engaging with brands, with importers, and looking at policy questions in the EU and the UK. We know it's a global economy, even though the US has now taken this very historic step. I mean, honestly, for all Americans, we really need to be proud of our democracy. There were no lobbyists involved, right? UHRP, the Uyghur American Association, Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, a wonderful ally, Jewish World Watch, and many other allies have worked diligently to get this passed without a single lobbyist dollar. That's not easy in this day and age. So this coalition, which I'll show you in the chat, can have endorsements, and then there are action items for campaigning to put more pressure on companies to be very clear on where they stand and to ensure that their supply chains are not profiting from the suffering. Finally, I'd like to mention being part of an ongoing dialogue by joining in the social media campaigns, petitions, and other future actions that are organized by some of the key groups. I'll mention just 3 in particular. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, uhrp.org. Please do follow us on social media. Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, a small volunteer group doing tremendous work, and Jewish World Watch. In addition to, of course, sessions like this that have been organized by JCRC Indianapolis and the other co-sponsors. And I would say let's not neglect as well financial support. I will just call out Advocacy Israel for collecting household goods for one of the survivors who we were able to rescue and bring to Virginia. And she and her children and her husband had nothing. They were not part of the US refugee admission system. They had no assistance from any refugee resettlement organizations, but the Uyghur community took them in. And a Christian group and Advocacy Israel, helped provide for their material needs. If this is something you'd like to organize, that'd be great. And of course, just a $5 a month donation to some of the groups that are specialized in this work truly, is a real contribution and shouldn't be overlooked. So with your financial support, if that's possible, and certainly with your moral support by following all of our social media campaigns, you can be part of this great movement. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Louisa, for covering, again, a lot of ground and a lot of good, specific, and clear action items, and answering one of the questions in the chat already from Michael about what we can do to help Uyghurs and welcome more refugees. So thank you for giving us something tangible on that. So I think before and thank you to those who've been putting questions in the chat. I'm going to get to as many of them as we can. But first, I'm going to turn more for that direct question, that direct focus on what we in the Jewish community can be doing, and again, as a community that is rooted in the term "never again" and the concept of "never again." It is critical for us to ask what our organizations and what we as the Jewish community are doing on this subject. So I'm going to be turning to Amber Mays, who is an expert in the field of genocide education and mass atrocity prevention. She has a focus on the Great Lakes region of Africa and legislative advocacy when she's not working on the Uyghur crisis. During her academic career, she interned for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which we've already heard from with Andrea, and the Enough Project in Washington, D.C., which I will take a second to shout out since it's where I spend part of my day job. Amber serves as the Holocaust Educator and Human Rights Associate for the Indianapolis Jewish Community Relations Council, and is the co-founder and executive director of the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention in Indiana. Amber, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brad. And I would like to also extend my gratitude to Mihrigul for having the bravery to speak out. You are truly an inspiration. So the question is, what has the Jewish community been doing? And over the past couple of years, the Jewish community has become increasingly more involved in this issue, in raising awareness and advocating for an end to the genocide. There have been multiple op-eds, multiple webinars such as this. There has been, last year, Jewish World Watch did a week of action. They did a Uyghur Seder to really kind of heighten the awareness level of what's going on. And Louisa, of course, has mentioned the advocacy level, that many Jewish organizations at the national level and at the local level as well, JCRCs across the country, for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, we wrote a resolution categorically denouncing the Uyghur genocide, and that it would become part of the tenets of JCRC across the country to make the genocide a priority in advocacy efforts. I think one of the questions that I often receive is, why this genocide in particular? Why, when there are so many other mass atrocities that are occurring around the world, why does the Jewish community feel so connected to this? And I think that there is this sort of, there's a collective memory. The community, the Jewish community, knows what it means to be on the receiving end of industrialized genocidal violence. That's not to say whatsoever that the Jewish community does not care or is not engaged in other areas, because they certainly are. We are engaged in Myanmar, in Congo, in Sudan, all around the world. But there's something that feels very different and almost visceral about this particular genocide. We see this sort of mirroring of what we saw in Europe in World War II. There is this most generational kind of trauma that we feel when we see and we hear such a Mihrigul story. When we see and we hear about people who are being forced onto a train, who are being forced to create goods that we have in our pockets, our cell phones, our clothing, our cars. When we see that these individuals, these humans, are placed in terrible conditions in what could only rightfully be called concentration camps, in my opinion. And then they disappear. And I think that is why this genocide, the genocide against the Uyghurs in particular, is so troubling to the Jewish community. And there are many ways in which you can get involved. Louisa mentioned several of them: contacting your member of Congress to co-sponsor the Uyghur Policy Act, and as well as finding out if there is a Uyghur community where you live or the closest one, building a bridge to the community, going to your synagogue and seeing if your rabbi could speak about this issue, raising awareness through programs through your own community. Once one voice begins to speak out, it sort of becomes this movement, and it's a movement that we have to keep pushing forward. And it's only going to become a loud voice, a cry, when we all come together. So I will end it there because I want to make sure that we get to as many questions as possible. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. And thanks to everybody. First of all, again, thanks to all of our panelists. And I really appreciate now the range of questions coming in, and we have about 15 minutes. And so I will try to work through with our panelists as many of the questions as possible. Obviously, some of them are pretty big questions, but we'll do our best, or else hopefully we can find ways to follow up afterwards. Let me start, if I can, and maybe it's the biggest question of all, but it is, at the core of the title of the program. It's at the core of what Rabbi Krinsky let us in with, which is how do we make this whole? And there was a question in the chat basically getting at the concept of, there have sadly been other genocides since the Holocaust, whether you look at Rwanda or Darfur, and in some cases we haven't been able to stop. In many cases we haven't been able to stop them, or our efforts have eventually brought some success, but with a lot of human cost. And as was noted in the question, in some ways the perpetrator here, China, has a level of political and economic power that is far greater than much of what we've seen in the past. So I guess I would ask a sort of open question to all of the panelists. How do you bring your arms around this question of how can we move forward, and what have we learned from the past? And I note another question in the chat talks about the Tibetans and the persecution of the Tibetans, which has been going on even longer. So what have we learned from these other campaigns, these other issues? And even if it's less rooted in the past, how do each of you working on this issue really face the level of horror that we're seeing? What gives you hope that we can really bring some change here? And any of you can just jump in as you wish.
I'm happy to speak briefly. It's a big question, and I think that's why all of us are doing the work that we're doing. I think in terms of what we have learned from failure after failure, I think something we're seeing more and more now is a greater focus on early warning, on early action, and trying to mitigate signs. The museum supports what's called the Early Warning Project that looks at risks of future mass killings around the world. And what we're trying to do is encourage the U.S. government, but also the broader concerned community internationally to get on an atrocity prevention footing instead of just a response to crises when they emerge, because the task at hand, of course, is much harder once mass atrocities are underway. And so I think encouraging people to look at some of those early warning signs is helpful. And that's, I think, a an optimistic trend that we're seeing. It's hard to use that term given the gravity and given the scale of the harm that we've seen over the course of the past several decades. And I think it's hard to exact, very specific lessons from the past, but I think in a general sense, what we've learned is that genocide is preventable. These crimes are not just inevitable. They don't kind of come out of the ether. There isn't one moment where genocide happens. We know that there are early warning signs. If we pay attention and galvanize the right attention early, we can be effective. And I think that's what all of us are trying to do. It's why I think so many people are a part of this conversation to know what more we can do. And trying to have things like what Louisa mentioned in terms of those small successes, knowing that people in the United States will not be, buying or consuming goods made with forced labor of Uyghur detainees. I think that is a good step forward, and I think we'll send a message to others about the moral imperative to stem these crimes. I share the pessimism that I think was included in the question as asked. But I do think there is a lot we can do when we focus on prevention and when we try to look a little more upstream at some of these crimes.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Mihrigul, Amber, Louisa, do any of you want to jump in quickly, and then I'll try to get to some other questions?
If you can hear me, the very fact that China is such a powerful actor and so enmeshed in global commerce means there are more points of leverage than some of the more out of the way places in the world. So this gives us hope when we can say that universities should not be having exchange programs, or researchers should not be working on DNA analysis based on forced collection of Uyghurs' DNA as part of the persecution of the Uyghurs as an ethno-religious group. So there are many points of leverage we haven't even begun to use. So that's one reason for hope. Second reason for hope is that, in fact, the experience of the Jewish people is something that, on a longer term basis, I believe that, in fact, one point that I'd like everyone to think about is what can Uyghurs learn from Jews as people who have survived multiple periods of exile and diaspora, life as a diaspora, and yet remain over time, individuals suffering tremendously, but in the next generation, it's still possible for people to flourish even at times when they've lost their homeland, and to give a hope that all is not lost, and that there are ways to intentionally have a community and a nation flourish despite genocide.
Thanks for that. Let me. I just want to make sure to give a chance for Mihrigul to come in and perhaps after providing the terrible and tragic details of your story, to give you a chance to talk about how you find a way of having hope that something will change on behalf of your family, people. Did we lose Mihrigul? Okay. Well, let me move on then, and hopefully she'll be able to reconnect. There are a few questions in the chat, and maybe to sort of, we planned this event specifically to coincide with the end of the Olympics, and there have been some questions in the chat about the Olympics, and certainly a number about businesses. And Louisa, in your last comment, you mentioned sort of points of leverage. And I think, obviously the Olympics are about to be over, and, but there will be future events in China related to China. And all of us will have the question of how we engage with, as has been mentioned throughout, products that we buy. China is economically and politically involved in many issues in our lives. And so how, do you all sort of think through the questions of boycotts? And obviously there's legal compliance with Forced Labor Prevention Act, but overall as a tool and as a way forward, should we all have been much louder around the concept of boycotting the Olympics, not just as a diplomatic boycott, but more directly? And how should we focus moving forward on whether it's divestment or boycotts or other kinds of actions like that?
A great question. I would say, one key is just persistence, right? Don't be discouraged if, some call for action doesn't succeed, right? These bills that did pass our Congress, both of them took each of them took more than 2 years to pass. Awareness grows slowly, right? So this is one of a long series of activities by the Holocaust Museum, by the JCRCs across the country, and of course by the Uyghur community. So don't give up on the value of persistence. Don't give up on the value of one case at a time. Sometimes one case can be a breakthrough. And I would say that, again, part of the complicity question, especially corporations or other actors, is not only moral cleanliness, but making the cost of continuing those policies too high. And so that's a cumulative process. And that's why persistence is the answer, not discouragement.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Andrea, did you want to come in?
I think that was well said.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And Mihrigul, do we have you back? I just want to make sure I don't want to keep moving forward. Okay. Let me turn to questions that have come in sort of around other community, the Muslim community, Israel, sort of, and maybe Louisa, I don't know if you from the Human Rights Project might be able to talk a little bit more directly to this, but across the board, what are, for example, on the UHRP side, I know there's a resource page that talks about all the different countries around the world that have declared this to be a genocide and have begun to take action. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the sort of international response beyond, as we think about the many actions we've talked about already that focus here in the U.S. And within the Jewish community? Can you maybe zoom out on the international side of the campaign a little bit?
Great question. Actually, the UK and Canada have both come a long way in terms of trying to have concrete attention to exactly the issue that Andrea originally raised of forced labor, parliamentary inquiries, case about implementing UK laws on genocide, and clear, it's still the case that the EU, where policymaking is even more difficult in a divided, partisan America, but yet there is progress on a human rights due diligence law. And many of the coalition partners in this coalition, I think I gave you all the link earlier, the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region, are working very diligently on that. And again, if you have the bandwidth, want to learn more, go to that website, scroll down and find the steering committee member groups. It's a very tight-knit group. I mean, honestly, the Uyghur groups and other groups were every week, 2 or 3 different hours on coordination meetings on all our joint efforts. So there's tremendous policy pressure building slowly in those countries. And I would say that, one question a lot of people have is, shouldn't the people who are living in Muslim majority societies and leaders of those societies be more outraged at the desecration of Islam, right? The criminalization of the Uyghurs' faith, which is pretty much almost all Muslims, and 800-year-old mosques, right? The first mosques that are built that are still standing date almost back to within just a couple of centuries of the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And so there should be quite a lot of sympathy, understanding what that might mean for society. And yet there's silence because of Chinese pressure, but that is building as well. So I see it as room for growth, where pushing back against Chinese diplomatic and economic pressure to keep silent, to vote with China and the UN is being peeled back, because it can't be hidden, as Andrea has said. We're making these efforts and we are succeeding against a powerful state actor that wishes to hide and be excused for its behavior.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to come in on that question of sort of the broad on that, or certainly as we have the last couple of minutes, feel free to come in on other subjects as well. Okay, let me, with maybe just the last, Amber, maybe if I can just turn to you. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about different kinds of actions that people can take, lawyers, getting in touch with your representative, finding out if there are Uyghurs in your community. Can you maybe talk for a minute, just 30 seconds or a minute, about the kinds of things you've been doing in Indianapolis, and sort of, where you've seen community members, rally a little bit, and the kinds of actions that people can take. And I think with an eye towards, hoping that people will reach out to locally to their own Jewish communities to figure out where those things can be done.
Sure. So I would say that in Indiana, we tend to be relatively lucky that we have a senator who is fairly engaged on human rights issues. And so we've been able to have open lines of communication with him on the Uyghur genocide. And I kind of want to bounce off a little bit of what Louisa was saying was, persistence. I think it's easy sometimes to get discouraged, but it's important to remember that advocacy, unfortunately, is often more a marathon than it is a sprint. And so I'm going to circle back a little bit to your elected officials. Contact your Jewish Community Relations Council. They're going to already be in contact, have good relationships with your elected officials, and they can help be that bridge between you as the constituent and your House of Representative member, your congresswoman, your congressmen, your senators. Again, also speak to your synagogue, your rabbi, reach out to churches, reach out to mosques. It's really all about relationship building and figuring out, and those individuals will be able to point you in the correct direction.
Thank you for that. And those are really important words of advice. I think we only have a couple minutes left. I want to ask one last question. I'm going to direct it and sort of give Andrea the last word, because I think it's an important issue, and again, sort of brings us back to the title of the event. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about where to go and where to get resources. I would, hopefully many of the links have been showing up, and I would direct you to the UHRP site in particular, and Jewish World Watch and others for those resources. But there's a question in the chat about sort of the Holocaust narratives and kind of the co-option of, we hear reference to the Holocaust and never again in a lot of different contexts these days, many of them often wildly inappropriate. And I think there's an important question for your center and what you hope to achieve sort of through the production of your report and speaking directly about the atrocities that are occurring. How do you sort of see the work of being able to put the actual stories out and the actual narratives in kind of carrying through the tradition of what the museum is meant to help prevent, and sort of within the large cacophony around the Holocaust and never again language and symbolism these days? And you have a very short amount of time to answer a huge question, so I apologize for that.
Thanks, Brad. It's a very important question, and all of us at the museum are also disturbed with the inappropriate conversations and kind of analogies to the Holocaust. The museum has said repeatedly that in making these kinds of comparisons, or simplifying, or inappropriately using the Holocaust is an affront to survivors, is an affront to the history that we're all trying to preserve. I think what we can learn from that and from the history of the Holocaust aren't these very simple connections, but rather the importance of early action. And knowing that when you walk through the permanent exhibition here at the Holocaust Museum, you see years before mass killing ever started, you see early warning signs. We have an exhibition open right now called Burma's Path to Genocide. You can see over decades, over years, warning signs that were missed. The communities at risk, human rights activists were all sounding the alarm, and yet it wasn't taken seriously. And I think where we are now, and we take some of those lessons and know that we do see the signs, we do see crimes happening. And this is an all hands on deck moment when we're talking about the plight of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that we need to be creative, use all the tools that Louisa has mentioned, that Amber has mentioned, in order to stop what's happening. And I think when we do that, we kind of reclaim never again. And there are people who use it inappropriately. I think remembering the importance of early warning to prevent mass atrocities is why we're all here. And I think it's a call to all of us to keep moving forward.
Thank you so much for that. And really those last words of just reclaiming what this is about, and reclaiming the memory, reclaiming never again through the actions that we've talked about, and through learning the stories that we've heard tonight, and through and through honoring those stories and honoring the past with the wide array of action that we have in front of us. So I want to be conscious of everyone's time, including our panelists, and bring the evening to a close by thanking each of our panelists for sharing your array of knowledge and experience, and obviously particularly to Mihrigul for your bravery, and sorry that the technology wasn't working to bring you back in, but we're all, I think, moving out of this event with your story and your family in our hearts. I want to just quickly thank all of the sponsors: Jewish World Watch, Uyghur American Association, 3GDC, UHRP, the Indianapolis JCRC, ADIS, and obviously to Vicky and Ron Halber at the JCRC here for all of the support in putting this on. And I do want to take a moment to thank the team that we have at ADIS Israel, who's been doing a wide array of events, and give a last plug. If you are local in the DC area, we do have monthly protests in front of the Chinese embassy. The next one will be next Thursday, February 24th. You can gather at 5:30 in front of ADIS Israel, which is on Connecticut Avenue in Porter, right by the Connecticut Avenue Metro. And there's a short walk up to the Chinese embassy. And so if you want a quick and direct way to show your voice and literally stand up in protest, this is one opportunity. And we hope to see you at future events and to see all of you active in this movement moving forward. So thanks again for joining. Thanks to all of our panelists. And hopefully we will be meeting again when we have made more progress on this, but certainly to keep telling the stories and learning as we go. So thank you all.